Good evening. I'm Milton Curry, Dean of the USC School of Architecture and the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture and to our spring public events series. I want to thank our public events committee and chair, Professor Yolande Daniels, and our communications team led by Assistant Dean Elizabeth Held. Professor Aman Ansari will moderate our Q&A this evening immediately following the lecture. And also this evening's lecture is supported by the Nancy and Edward Fox Urban Design Critic Endowment. So we thank Ned and Nancy for their wonderful support for the school. It's really a great pleasure to welcome to the school. And again, I wish I could welcome them physically here in person in Los Angeles, but it's a great pleasure nonetheless to welcome Michael Manfredi and Marion Weiss to USC Architecture. Weiss Manfredi, the architecture firm, is really an architecture, landscape, and urbanism firm at the forefront of architectural design practice, redefining the relationships between landscape, architecture, infrastructure, and art. Named one of North America's emerging voices by New York's Architectural League, Weiss Manfredi received the 2020 Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medal in Architecture and the 2018 Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Institution's National Design Award, as well as the New York American Institute of Architects Gold Medal and the Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, all well deserved. Most recently, Weiss Manfredi was selected through an international competition to re-envision our own world-renowned La Brea Tar Pits Museum in downtown Los Angeles, just next to LACMA. And also the Trinity Park Conservancy in Dallas selected the firm to serve as design architects to bring new life to the former Jesse R. Dawson State Jail. In thinking about this evening's remarks, I look back at some of the work that Weiss Manfredi has done and how it has influenced the fields of architecture, landscape, infrastructure, urbanism. And, the Seattle Art Museum, the Olympic Sculpture Park was such a impactful project, I think, in terms of students and others kind of looking at the intersection between architecture and landscape and infrastructure. They've done some really amazing campus buildings at Yale University Center for Innovative Thinking, the Cornell Veterinary and Life Sciences Building, the Tata Center for Cornell in its New York campus. The Museum of the Earth in Ithaca is a project I know well from my years in Ithaca. And their work is just so well received and situated for its site, for its client. And I find that in these and other works of theirs, they really work collaboratively, and they blend really and overlap the traditional roles of architect with engineer, landscape architect, urbanist, urban designer. And they construct meaningful, respectful working relationships with clients, constituencies, and diverse communities. As a young professor at Cornell, I'm not sure exactly when we met, but I didn't know them, and yet they were very supportive of me and established an immediate rapport due to their love both of the profession and of academia. And I think that joint intersection between the profession, the practice, and academia is one that they move fluidly between. They both teach. Marion Weiss is currently teaching at Penn and is a professor there. And Michael is teaching at Harvard at the Graduate School of Design. And two words really come to mind when I think of both Marion and Michael in watching their evolution over the years as practitioners, but also their interactions with people. And the two words are integrity and class. They both exude these qualities wherever they are and whoever they're with. And I think that's in addition to their enormous talent in putting together their projects and having established a great firm and a great group of people to work with. Those are qualities that I think both are personal qualities as well as professional qualities. And I think it's one of the reasons why they've been so successful and are producing such great work. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi to USC Architecture.
Thank you. That was a very generous introduction, Milton, and I'm very pleased to be here as someone who's known you for a number of years, and I think I can speak for Marion that we're delighted to be in LA virtually, one of our favorite cities, and it's a pleasure to be talking to students and faculty. So,
and I think we just want to add, I think, Milton, that was a very generous introduction, and perhaps one of the things that's so moving for us about the mission that USC brings to its School of Architecture, Department of Architecture, and I think, Milton, the values that you probably continue to instill is that USC talks about the development of architects as citizens, and citizens who actually have agency in the way they shape the world. And Michael and I have often thought about our architecture as having to become citizens of the places that they impact and join. And so there's a resonance there that we find incredibly meaningful.
so with that, we will start, and hopefully great. I think, do you see the first, the title of our talk, Constructing Sites? I think in many ways, this is emblematic of what drives us, what kind of brings the passion to our work. And I think it goes without saying that architecture, design, however you define it, probably in its broadest of terms, has never been more urgent and has never had the level of agency that it does now, given the fact that the world is quite a bit smaller and quite a bit more extreme. The idea of this sort of gentle orb passively inhabiting a much larger solar system is something that is, I think, increasingly brought into focus. And the fragility of it, I think, for us, calls for solutions that are not utopian. Utopian solutions tend to be exclusionary. They tend to be singular. And I think by way of a manifesto, we actually look for incremental urbanism, projects that are incremental, that take in, for example, their tactical topographies, are much more open-ended. And there are great examples around the world that continue to inspire us, in this case, the fabric of Rome and its development, or perhaps thinking of Fumihiko Maki's beautiful hillside housing in Tokyo, which developed incrementally, developed gently, and it's about architecture as a network rather than as a singular object. And even Le Corbusier, who could be perhaps, whose work could be misconstrued as being overly heroic, at the Carpenter Center, this rather small building actually reaches between two blocks, and through its very beautifully choreographed ramp connects both the academy and the residential community around it.
I think, you know, as we start to think about our interest in, if you will, the incomplete notion of what a site is, it's incomplete because a site actually has boundaries, but in fact, we're interested in the kind of systems that are larger, whether they're infrastructural or natural. And in fact, our hunch is that those boundaries themselves are artifices that we have very little interest in unless we can start to think about the public dimension that they can offer as we start to think about architecture. So our book, Public Nature's Evolution Infrastructure, really tries to look at that liminal space between, in the case here, just showing an example of the way we tend to think of it is thinking about it all at once. And this is our sketch before the Olympic Sculpture Park really came into kind of fruition as a full idea. It was really thinking about the simultaneity of being able to add, and actually in that adding, be able to keep the things that are alive and in movement in a city in motion, while perhaps introducing something new that could create connections where divisions had existed. And so that notion of a kind of infrastructural approach to something that could have a light touch was something that we were really honored to be able to be invited by the Grafton team to say, what would it be like to think about lines of movement as a way of thinking about design or architecture? And these lines of movement for us were not just present in our own work, which were kind of infrastructural in nature, but we were super interested in these kind of hyper hybrid projects which had maybe infrastructural underpinnings, but very incredible social dimensions. And it's that tension then that we set up in dialogue as part of the work that we were doing with our research studios, which was to really disassemble and reassemble these hybrid infrastructures to understand the there and those elements that are in movement, to be able to create a place at the Biennale where we could be invited in and also have a chance to have a departure to see both that historic work, which has informed our own, and the contemporary sense of our own work in motion. So this drum at the Biennale in this incredibly old space was one where this charred wood could be lined then as a host or a window, both outside the space and within of these infrastructural models that were both of our own work and those that inspired us.
So we'll share a number of projects tonight. They're not in chronological order. They're linked perhaps thematically. We'll start with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which is a project we did over 10 years ago, and we're still working with a botanic garden. But the Botanic Garden is it's an oasis in the city, and the idea was to provide an entry point into the garden. So you can see these early studies, we were interested less in a building as an object, but more as a building as a transition from city to garden. And in this early sketch, you can start to see the beginnings of taking this building as an itinerary and stretching it out almost 400 feet from city to garden wall. So on the city side, it's overtly architectural. It has a kind of a copper roof that is already starting to patinate. And it, in a way, is an invitation to a very, very broad constituency. Brooklyn's an incredibly dynamic part of New York, borough of New York, and incredibly mixed. But we're also interested in the meter of architecture, in giving that sort of promenade a very specific sense of how it could be measured and metered. And you can see this little drawing here. The building becomes, in a way, part of the topography of the garden. But it's also a very hardworking building. It contains a number of systems that allow you to take water, collect it, clean it. There are a series of geothermal wells, so the building, in a sense, powers itself effectively. But we're particularly intrigued with the idea that you could perhaps walk through the building.
And as you walk through the building, in a sense, be guided by the shadows that are cast from this translucent trellis of glass that lines the outside of the building on the urban edge and then lines the garden inside. And as you actually find this liminal space between the garden and the city, there is a moment that we almost call that flatiron place of magic, where you can turn left and join the city or turn right and find your way into the garden. And that idea of actually this geometry, which you could say maybe superficially pulls from the Olmsted curvilinear plan of the garden, in some ways is also tuned more importantly by things like this rare green flowering cherry tree, so that in fact the arc of that that roof is following the drip line of that tree to protect it. And so that space between the visitor center, which is giving you guidance, is really there to actually encourage you to go out into the garden. And yet there are places or moments where there is the event space, which is, I think, the only two-sided room in New York that can seat 160 for a lecture. It's really the kind of terminal space that wells up as an inhabitable topography that actually becomes legible as its green planted roof here, a 10,000 square foot garden itself in its infancy right here, captures that 22-foot grade change. But what we're really interested in is at times the architecture disappears and the garden asserts itself far more profoundly. And there's just a whisper of that relationship between architecture and landscape, and that sense of it being in many ways equally balanced and yet ultimately submitting to the garden itself comes into focus about our most recent project there, which Michael will speak about, which is a fully inhabitable 600-foot path from the subway top into the garden.
One of the big challenges with the public garden is accessibility, and accessibility not only for folks who are challenged in terms of moving around, but in this case, trying to connect to the subway, which opens up a whole set of incredible opportunities. This was the last bit of open space, a kind of orphan part of the garden, orphan site, and very much destabilized. So it was a chance for us to continue the sort of, I guess, the thesis of the visitor center, which is to kind of meter the transition from architecture to landscape. So architecture is at the bottom, overtly structural, and then it slowly melts into the landscape. But it does so, I think, with, we hope, a clear sense of purpose. So in this case, it's a fully ADA route, about 400 feet stretched out. But the idea was to kind of provide a kind of choreography of movement up and down the hill. And you can see that movement very carefully metered in this sort of sequential section, a kind of MRI. And we're very interested in the topography and the development of a site as a kind of architectural artifact. And that artifact then is given further measure through the sort of panelization of a series of retaining walls that meter your journey, provide places of pause. There's about 202 different panels, each one unique, both sectionally and planimetrically. So the development of this as a constructed site, which is of interest, you can start to see here halfway through construction, and the kind of the shift over 25 feet as you move laterally and vertically for us was extremely interesting, this sort of sense of choreography. And you can start to see that as you sort of move up from the lower levels of the garden. Across the top, it's very heavily planted with a whole host of ground covers that have olfactory qualities, so that you kind of, in a way, emerge through a garden with your senses fully attenuated. We'll see if this film works. Hopefully the sound will work. The sense of sound is very important to us. And of course, being in a garden, we have the pleasures of hearing children, seeing people move, the sense of shadow, the smell, which of course we can't enjoy now, but the haptic qualities that architecture can help reveal increasingly are important to our work.
And so in many ways, this whole idea of a journey can even inform for us the idea of a vertical promenade in a building as unlikely as a nanotechnology center. And at the University of Pennsylvania, we really were interested here that the space between the edge of the city and the edge of the campus was truly a kind of a bleak engineering part of the campus where landscape, if you will, did not have a shred of a chance. And yet we actually had the gift between these tight lab buildings to be able to take advantage of the fact that the vibration and electromagnetic interference would be greatest at the edge of the site where street vibrations could infect things. And so we could actually push all the way back into the site some of the most profoundly important microscopy characterization and clean room areas, and then pull out to the front those that didn't have vibration criteria, creating an opportunity now for a new central landscape that would in many ways behave more like the landscapes in the city and the campus. And as we start to think about that, then the one element that could have all the vibration in the world within safety limits would be the place of convening and gathering. So rather than having that at the main level, the event space or the forum is really elevated up in the air, framing and reaching out to vistas of the campus. And yet, in many ways, this very simple notion of these cubic unfolding boxes for the labs are a little bit more complex to engineer, suspended and cantilevered out as they are. And in fact, this space here with the suspended elements and gravity-bound ones are framed now by this strange amber. And the amber glass itself is performative. Most clean rooms just have an amber portal and solid walls to block out the infrared rays. And our sense was that this was a gift to reveal the technological obligations for this science and let this amber glass be a place that would reveal the sciences that were at work in the clean room and then also protect the science that was within. And so it's this kind of space that hinging behind the scenes and allowing the behind the scenes now to inform the kind of community of the future. And our hunch is that the kind of pipeline community will wonder what that amber is. And all of a sudden, as they are sharing their own science projects with the faculty at Penn, beginning to be curious about what that destination could be for them inside.
So it's actually the idea of this public area, this kind of very thin, in a way, vestibule to the city or vestibule to the sciences that is of great interest to us, the kind of publicness of what is often a laboratory, one of the most overtly private buildings. But we're also intrigued with the idea of movement through a building, just as we were at the Botanic Garden. So the stairs invite a place to pause, to sit, to wait. The continuation of the choreography, either through stairs or elevators, allows someone to kind of take in the sciences as they start to unfold. And then finally, as Marian mentioned, the kind of the sort of the pinnacle of the promenade is a truly public room that's public to the whole university and to others outside of the university. So this becomes a place to convene. If the labs are hermetic, this is more public. And that room is overt in terms of its presence on the street. You can start to sense how it starts to make this kind of three-dimensional Mobius courtyard and establish a strong presence. There's also the idea of capturing water, which for us, the kind of ecological measures that are so obvious now. Water is precious. So here we catch water on an upper terrace and then host it in a underground cistern in the courtyard so they could be used for irrigation. Again, the presence of this building in the city is something that we hope can be captured in the content. The sounds of the street are part of the architecture for us. The hollowness of a large volume. And this is a 24-hour building, so how it plays out by morning, afternoon, also part of the architecture. So we quickly shift to a more recent project in New York City. And here, very significant research building on Roosevelt Island, a kind of magic. It's an island in the middle of the city, like Ile de la Cité, is an incredible opportunity. And for us, it was an opportunity to think less about the building, but more about the views that it would frame both to Manhattan and to Queens. So the building becomes a sort of in a way, a machine to understand the context and a machine to also appreciate the challenges of climate change. And in New York, a city that is very much prone to flooding, this becomes a building to think about a kind of a piano nobile, which establishes a second ground plane above the FEMA obligations. It's also the idea of how do you move through a multi-story building? How do you engender a sense of community internal to the building itself? So the promenade, the route becomes quite critical. And that route starts in a public plaza, a public space. Actually, you can see Tom Main's building just to the left, where these two buildings start to enter into a conversation with each other.
And I think it's, Michael's described this in many ways. We were struck initially by a footprint that seemed, incredibly boxy. And it was this river to river vista that could actually carve through and give an invitation to see that this building, which is truly that space between research and the entrepreneurs, could actually have a place where that was that space that was halfway part of the building and halfway part of the landscape of the campus was also one that would bring that topography from the outside and come into the inside. And so this was our passion, I suppose. Every time we think about the opportunity to create the Spanish Steps, we find an excuse to think about this inhabitable topography as also a place of theater. And so there are these kind of collaborative plug-in zones and also vistas now into the makerspace on the left, the graduate studio research area here on the right. And even that research studio and collaborative space is topographic in its nature as it reaches up actually to offer the greatest vistas below of the landscape. And as we continue that ascent, it truly is sort of weaving that relationship between the scholars and the entrepreneurs, because this is the building that is intended to actually connect those communities. And it's being a studiously inefficient space where circulation exists, so collaboration can take place. And yet it's also curiously a building with 8 corners rather than 4 as you might have on a typical block. And so that allows these edges to actually have magical light and a sense of intimacy, even when you're on the prow of that ship. And that prow is really something that we were lucky enough to be able to take our 22,000 square foot obligation of solar panels and hoist them in the air another 12 feet so that we could create a kind of sheltered and, in a sense, shady place to invite people to the roof to actually enjoy probably one of the most extraordinary views in all of Manhattan. And so that really is that kind of, as Michael described, the piano nobile hoisted above the kind of FEMA flood level and then some, and the building itself levitating even further to be more like the bridges in the distance and in a sense, join the kind of community, the campus in the city. And so the idea of creating campuses and creating places in the city that are as much about that open space as they are about the buildings has become an extraordinary opportunity at U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India. And in this case, we're adding to a campus that was begun so brilliantly by Edward Durrell Stone in 1959. You can see this main embassy building, and he took inspiration from the kind of reflective magic that he discovered at the Taj Mahal. And yet, for us, that inspiration could draw even further back, where the notion of gardens and fortifications and walls are always in combination with water, a place of magic. And so that kind of magic, as you could say, continued even further, and then not so far away, administration of Obama playing basketball in the near the Chancery. And you can also see Jackie Kennedy there with the large reflecting pool in the distance at that moment in 1961. And yet that question of how do you add to it and how do you actually rejuvenate it and make it a destination was one where we realized that as we add new buildings and rejuvenate the existing ones, we could begin to think of it not as one building after another on a site, but maybe one building because of another, linked through a wandering slalom or connective tissue or tapé vert of landscape that could connect across both precincts, the Chancery and the Enclave. And so what you can see is that the working honorific landscape here in the front is being added to by our new building, which is just directly set back and yet adjacent to the main Chancery, and that will serve those new purposes. And it's one where you can see that kind of space that's between both the Chancery and our new building in dialogue with each other, with both the canopies, the fortifications, and a more robust brise soleil and a water element brought closer to the building so that the evaporative cooling is no longer just ceremonial, but also part of the experience of the building. It's also one where the idea of both walls creating both, if you will, security, but also more importantly, place and destination is one where it wanders both outside the buildings and into them to create something new again.
So this idea of walls in traditional Indian culture, walls are also places to welcome ceremonially. You enter a wall, you're into a special precinct, but the kind of conversation between the wall and the arbor, or the kind of shaded canopy, in this case of Dolonex trees, becomes an opportunity to think about landscape in architectural terms and also in environmental terms. So the kind of royal palms mark this diagonal route that Marion was talking about. But it's also an opportunity to introduce measures whereby in India, there's either too much water during the monsoons or increasingly not enough during the drought season. So we're collecting water in a giant cistern under the reflecting pool and using it over the course of the year when water, again, think of it as a very precious material, something to be treasured. So that sense of treasuring water is also deployed architecturally, where probably 30% of the building is below grade, which does two things. It keeps the heating and the cooling of the building much more stable, but also allows the new building to be no higher than the beautiful existing Chancery to the right. So it's a very sectionally dynamic building with multiple levels that move both in and out through a series of sunken and contained gardens. And those gardens, again, as Marion talked about, provide levels of ceremony, they provide levels of welcome, and they define areas. In this case, the more public areas, the more honorific areas of the embassy compound. But you can also see then, as you emerge from these highly attenuated, highly sculptural elements back into a garden, shaded routes. So the development of the life of a building operates both inside and outside with equal balance. And that balance also extends to how the exterior surfaces are modulated. And we're very interested in the idea, the environmental idea of a jolly screen, which modulates light in a country like India, where light is extraordinarily bright and very intense. And this was a preoccupation of Edward Durrell Stone early on. The jolly screen was almost a little too dense, so it's difficult to work behind it. So we looked at something a little more open, a little more porous, and developed a series of vertical striations that help mitigate the light. And similarly, there are a series of canopies that weave both in and out of the buildings to provide shade and again, capture water, a most precious of elements. So you can start to see the kind of function that Marion talked about, the broad roof, which is in a way like an umbrella or a sunshade, the treatment of water in terms of evaporating cooling to kind of slowly cool very particular parts of this project very surgically. And again, the sense that these elements recall, perhaps in a new way, traditional Indian architecture. We've just completed a project in Florida, very similar climate, very hot, and also prone, in this case, to the ravages of Hurricane Irma not too long ago, which took the museum, which you see here, part of the arts complex. And while it didn't destroy them, there was significant water infiltration. So effectively, the building had to be completely rebuilt. All the art had to be moved out, cleaned. And it was an opportunity to kind of, in a way, open up what you see is this very hermetic box, almost mausoleum quality that basically says to the community, don't come in. This is a museum. It's precious. And we were very intrigued with taking the box and stretching it and working with our clients, introducing performance, music, so that the arts could be seen as much more synthetic. It wasn't just about fine art, painting, sculpture, but also about music. And in so doing, we were also very interested in shaping a courtyard, kind of a giant outdoor room. So this is what it was shortly after Hurricane Irma. Again, lots of water inside the museum. But we took it out, and in a way, the architecture was as much about removal as it was about addition. The sculpture Paley Gates were preserved, and there's an open air courtyard, which becomes, in effect, an outdoor gallery. And where this kind of giant bubble sort of interrupted this sort of sense of a community, we wanted the museum to be much more open. The courtyard opens itself out to the community. It says, come in, it's an invitation. But it also, I think there's an opportunity of using water in a very precious way. So the sound of water automatically starts to cool you. And again, we can kind of save as much of the existing landscape as we possibly could and could augment it. The building is stretched, so it kind of has a long presence and helps shape space to the south. And you can start to see how by grafting old and new through the development of this undulating wall, this sort of giant bay window, we could connect the opaque galleries with a series of outdoor spaces.
I think what was interesting is that this had been a loading dock entry and yet a heavily used entry because it was near parking. And so for our purposes, it seemed like an opportunity to say that it was yet another portal to welcome people, to reveal this kind of cross-disciplinary art and performing arts together. And literally the shell or the cladding of it, a rain screen, durable and resilient, was something that could also become a kind of proscenium-like gateway. So for those on the roadway looking towards, there literally is an elevated notion of the indoor and outdoor connection to the arts. And that passage to the courtyard is one that also is also a passage between materials. In this case, you can see the stone, which is the lining of the courtyard making its way out to the street. And then the fluted metal, picking up the notion of the incredible organ in the Great Hall adjacent to the building, as the cladding itself that runs that full stretch that is in the extended element that Michael just described. And again, you can see these portals through both walls are lenses into something, and yet that sense of a kind of mural promise at the arrival court is one where you can see that transition between the fluted metal and the stone itself that leads you again from what had been really that bubble of an arrival into one that is a cut or a carving behind that stone to bring into the rejuvenated galleries, but also from our point of view, the new spaces where rehearsal and performance actually brought music to the world of art and visual arts here. And you can also see this kind of acoustically tuned room is one that makes its way out to the kind of geometries that you see that are lining that courtyard. And those geometries are such that our hunch is that the invitation into this place of music and this place of visual art is one that the entire community feels welcome to. And what had been a place that had been behind that fortification is now, I think, particularly in this kind of COVID moment, has become the destination for movies outside at night and actually screenings of performances that are taking place indoors. And so that sense of what it means to actually invite people in, but also construct a site, and the title of her talk is Constructing Sites, is sometimes actually taking incredibly unpromising places and being given some of the very smallest kinds of opportunities to give it identity and form. And we were invited to do this tiny 12,000 square foot Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, where the idea was that there was enough concrete and opacity surrounding it where engineering was residing, that what they needed was transparency to invite all the disciplines to come together to convene. All they had left was this particular roof terrace over a lab. And next to the windowless Becton by Breuer, completely hidden, if you will, between the kind of collegiate Gothic on the right and the contemporary brutalist on the left. And so our hunch was that it would be very interesting just to get a little peek or a window at what that might mean behind in the courtyard, and almost like the Tempietto lure you or tempt you in to wonder what's happening in this place that had been the backside of so many buildings, but maybe now could be reconfigured like many of Yale's destinations into a legible courtyard. And that took a little bit more work, though. You could imagine here we are with a 15-foot grade change and a massive wall of concrete between the collegiate Gothic Sterling courtyard and that plaza above. And so by removing that wall, we could truly create now this place where this long oval, self-supporting, undulating glass lab, if you will, could become a temptation to come inside and convene a kind of working studio for all the engineering and design arts at Yale. So what you can start to see is it truly is, particularly at night, a place that is very, very different than the engineering buildings surrounding it. And it now has almost an Acropolitan-like relationship to what had been behind a wall, now is forward to and a prow of a central new extended green. And it's one where really what we were so excited about was that by having this kind of curvature to the glass, both inverted and extroverted, we could avoid columns or the kind of intermediate mullions that would have been required horizontally, because in fact, like a curved piece of paper, which is stronger rested on a tabletop than a flat piece, we could actually have this self-supporting environment.
So this kind of elliptoid shape, in a way, is the living room for a number of research labs that surround it. So like any living room, it should be used for many different purposes, many different kinds of community events, many different kinds of formal and informal events. But we also love the idea of the transformative capacity of architecture. So in this case, there's a giant curtain, a kind of saffron colored curtain that could be drawn so the room becomes completely introverted, while there's a sort of band of clear fabric that allows you to look out. So the sense of transforming from extroverted to introverted spaces is particularly interesting to us. As you slide up the stair, you always have a sense of the kind of geography of the building and its context. You can look down on a set of activities, but perhaps you can just slide, like at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center, you can just slide by the building and enjoy the activity within. And that activity, of course, occurs across the full spectrum of months, weeks, times of day. And we particularly love the kind of serendipity that the fluted and curved glass provides in terms of, in a way, entering into a dialogue with its neighbors. So now we'll, second to the last project, but a project very close to our hearts, La Brea. And it's an extraordinary opportunity to think about the city very much of the future, I think, which is characteristic of how LA sees itself, but also realize that that future is based on a past that is increasingly interesting, increasingly revelatory, and literally bubbling up as we speak. So it's a sense of taking the museum on Wilshire, Hancock Park, and in a way, tweaking what's best about it, and in a way, bringing it quite literally to life, as you can see happening here, where excavations are literally happening over the course of each day. And what's also happening as the Pleistocene era is being revealed, the lessons of climate change are becoming increasingly important. So how to stitch together this very complex, very dynamic, unique site into a kind of a whole. And we realized that one of the challenges is that the whole was not greater than the sum of the parts. So how could we analyze both inside and outside and start to see them as one experience, perhaps by animating the westernmost edge of the site. We could also connect it to the most public center of Hancock Park, a truly public park, but also bring the museum effectively to Wilshire so it can become a very active participant in the city. And how might we see all of these together as a series of interconnected loops rather than singular experiences that were disconnected for the visitor? And it's also an opportunity to bring the didactic quality of a museum out into the site. So what's inside and outside is one experience. And you can start to see how that's sort of stitched together. So we hope that the journey, wherever that journey might start, might be episodic and continual, and spark a level of interest in the incredible activity that's occurring subsurface, and quite literally talking about the importance of climate change. Talk about the importance of bringing new ecologies to this site, and also the importance of health, as we now know through the lens of the pandemic, the importance of health and open space and the reciprocity of those two.
And yet the reciprocity between health, open space, and an invitation into this incredible landscape is one that you could say feels a little bit formidable right now behind the fence. And our hunch was that it would be great to discover through not only the lenses on the site, which Michael described as a loop, but maybe the lenses on the walls, and that maybe part of it would be saying that there is some mystery and some sort of legislated vistas that are so remarkable as we kind of pull in from Wilshire. And so if we think about the arrival court here now, maybe more devoted to paving than it is to discovery, our thought was that perhaps if there is just that expansion of that experience around and new shade equity with this kind of canopy, if you will, that simulates the kind of found leaves on the tar, that we could actually start to bring together these loops and lenses into something that is truly urban at its Wilshire edge, and one that is actually almost truly natural as you wander through the kind of research garden, if you will, where excavation exists. And that idea is to be lured into the world of science, which is happening 363 days a year on site, that research below. And that is truly a place where you could say those who are scientists and those who are scientists to be can be drawn together into a kind of theatrical forum. And yet what had been a solid berm to kind of conceal what was going on in the museum, we felt that it would be intriguing to actually carve right through it and reveal literally what is happening inside and extend a new wing so exhibition could have room to breathe. So you could start to see that our feeling was that the kind of beloved core museum was one that could grow, and a passage that could connect through could be something that would allow that which was strong to be retained, but become even stronger by the eventual expansion into something that was generous enough in section to host things. And yet what is currently now not accessible to wheelchairs, the upper level plinth is one of the most amazing destinations and places. It's a great view. So being able to leverage that, make it accessible through a journey, was also one where we could reveal that, you know, with a cafe and a connection to the public Hancock Park, and also the research within, this kind of sense that there's movement and discovery literally right around the corner, so that the collections like this that are currently hidden and that are part of the legacy of what was found on the site and why the museum exists and why the site continues to endure, is one that could be brought into this kind of panoramic sense of discovery and not hidden behind the scenes, but revealed to those who could make it in here. And the sense of awe, that kind of magic of what the tar produced and has revealed and preserved for us, is something that continues to be part of a course of science. And so within that kind of crescent band that went from the green to the museum, that crescent continues into the research labs. But it's not just research, but the idea of spectacle that we think is so LA is one where you can imagine the kind of traveling journey of mammoths and mastodons seen at night like a drive-in movie, is one where we could say that it could be indeed a place of discovery, magic, and of enduring kind of legacy for the community to continue to convene, and also be a place of crossing and promise. And so we're on our way, if you will, in a concept phase, and very excited about the future phases to bring this to life.
Last project is Hunters Point South Park on New York's East River. And it too deals with issues of community engagement, climate change, environmental concerns. It's a site that has had many histories, from one of the most fertile wetlands in the 1700s to a very intensely urbanized area at the turn of the century, but also, given Hurricane Sandy, increasingly fragile. And prior to the hurricane, we were extremely interested in how flooding could be treated not as something to be kind of pushed off through armored walls, but embraced and in a way through a series of soft edges like sponges. That flooding could be mitigated in perhaps much more successful and strategic ways. It's a very active community park with a dog park, playing fields, and a large oval. Large oval is interesting because it actually conceals a giant cistern. So when the Hurricane Sandy came and flooding literally enveloped the park, water was captured and slowly released so that it lost a lot of its destructive capacity. And that was a great lesson again. It's a very hardworking park with a pavilion that captures water and uses it for irrigation. But the south-facing pleats also have solar panels so that it's a park that literally runs by itself and is autonomous in terms of the power grid. But it's also a sense that at times you can be alone or with a group of folks playing soccer. At times you can play in the reconstituted beach with the kind of plantings and the sort of plant materials that one would have found here in pre-colonial times. But like our other projects, it's a way in which it can complete itself only through its context, in a way, receiving a much larger infrastructural idea beyond itself. So that idea is about ferry stops. It's about framing a view, providing a kind of a pleasure, providing a set of new opportunities, in this case, phase 2, to reintroduce the wetlands that had been there and were erased by the sort of industrial past. And it's about establishing a place where you can take in this great view and in a way make it your own, bring what might be background into the foreground.
I think what's extraordinary about this site is that unlike the straight edge of much of the kind of waterfront, this was an irregular edge that had immense topography. And so we realized that we had an opportunity to leverage the sense of spectacle on the uppermost levels, but also imagine the kind of intimacy of being down near a kind of reconstructed wetland that could be in many ways protected. So the idea of the spectacle of the city and supporting that through a pier and almost boat-like element was one that was literally fabricated by boat builders and craned into the site to actually create this hovering element that would be over the wetlands. And here you can see truly a fortified wall. We talked about the fortifications of the utopian cities, but this is a case of that fortification being walkable and one that supports a wetland so that you could truly feel at times, and inviting, so you could truly feel that you're leaving the urgency of the city so that you can wander literally on the water's edge, a sense of almost walking on water. And that sense of walking on water and walking on this fortification is something that we think can happen almost nowhere else in the city, and yet it was a hardworking necessity to build this to protect that wetland. And yet as we follow the topography around, it really creates a kind of promontory that turns as it moves around to Newtown Creek and creates places to get away and away from the density of recreation phase 1 that we were looking at earlier, to this place that's a lot more natural, a lot more discovered, and narrower walkways to actually induce a sense of discovery. And one element that had nearly been washed away in Hurricane Sandy was an island that we effectively created by pulling away the peninsula's edge to have a traveling element to come to an island, in this case, that has ridiculously amazing views of the city, and in fact redefines and reconstitutes a piece of the site into a legible destination. But the multiplicity of means of movement, from bikes to pedestrians to cars to water, are literally sandwiched here between a water collection rill, if you will, buried in landscape. And that's a complement to the fully constructed elevated walkway that does exactly the opposite. It emerges from the water. And yet this sense of being able to have this promontory that is civic, if you will, in scale and brings you to the water's edge is one where finally our sense is that it's the gift to the city. The urgency of it needs to be complementary to the park that connects itself to the water's edge. And our hunch is that in many ways, while we want to leverage as much as we can from what a site already has, You could argue that views are everywhere and they are meaningless until we give them shape and focus and dimension. And being able to leverage and add and invent elements of the site that were never there as structural obligations can now have a sense of engagement and civic opportunity. It's really for us what we think architecture for us is really all about. So with that, we're really thrilled and honored again to be able to be part of this dialogue
Conversation.
with you all and conversation with you all, and look forward to further conversation. We see something that says, "Who does the sketches?" that just popped up in the chat. Both Michael and I do the sketches, and often we're doing them both together on the same one. So.
Yeah, we're both left-handed, so at times I'll start a drawing, Marion will finish it, at times she'll start. And it's a way in which we can have a conversation.
So we'll welcome any further questions, and I see.
Thank you, Michael and Marion. I don't know if I can share my screen, my camera, or yes.
There we go.
Yes, great. Thank you for this wonderful lecture and for sharing your work. Before I start with the questions, I just want to let you know, I first got a chance to see your work when I was a student at the GSC. And at the time you had just completed the Seattle Olympic Park, and it was a very inspiring talk, and it had a deep influence on me as an urban design student. And I'm sure the lecture, especially for our students here, was also as inspirational. And I wanted to actually ask you something that maybe you didn't talk as much about, which has to do with, of course, your practice, your academic work, and deals with the idea of challenging the disciplinary boundaries we deal with landscape, with art, architecture, and urban design. And I'm very interested in how does that approach informs the way you practice the actual, like when you start. I like the idea, the question about the sketches. I was wondering about that. And how do you start from these wonderful sketches and end with the buildings? And what happens in the process? And part of it, I think my question is more on a practical term, kind of matter, which has to do with the distribution of knowledge and expertise within these three disciplines, and how that comes together in your office, in the way the teams are set up and how they work together and how you work with them. But the other aspect to that is how does that interaction and workflow inform or challenge the way we as architects typically practice architecture, and the way architecture is produced, the way the process works, and ultimately the way it's built or represented.
Yeah,
Maybe
great question.
It's a great question, and you had a lot of questions in there, so I might begin with a couple of things that you touched on, which is that in many ways, if we start to think about maybe the thesis of our work, which leans towards a more cross-disciplinary approach, rather than maybe polishing the top of the architectural pyramid first and foremost, I think what we tend to do is to delay conclusions absolutely as long as possible, so that the panoramic scope of our research does include a deeper understanding of, say, the urban aspects, the ecological aspects, the social aspects, the kind of dimensions of what has been missing in a site. And or you saw with India too, a deeper history, or with La Brea, the deepest history that we can find. And by postponing those conclusions, we can also then, you see with the sketches, and we didn't share so many models, the kind of noodling around that is not nearly as precise as you could say maybe a specific digital model might allow us initially to do. And yet it's the kind of simultaneity of working with all of these forms, including the highly rigorous ones, with a team of folks in our office who range from having tremendous experience with urban design and landscape and architecture to those who are really in their infancy, and in a sense the kind of mistakes along the way are almost more exciting than the kind of obvious conclusions that one might draw.
Yeah, I think I'll tackle. I think there were several lines of thought in that very provocative question. La Brea, for example, is an interesting project because it was a competition, but we also were able to engage and sought out a kind of team of experts that typically would fall outside of the spectrum of typical architectural consultants. So we talked with and worked with a cinematographer. We worked with a paleobotanist. We worked with a horticulturalist. We worked with a graphic designer.
A naturalist and artist, right.
And an artist whose work is very much embedded in the depiction of nature. And in a way, I would say all of these different voices had a way in which they could shape the design as it evolved, perhaps in subtle ways, maybe not so overt. But I think we try wherever possible to engage a larger field of expertise. And I think the other thing to mention, and Marion touched on this, we have the luxury of sharing our work, but I think we're also standing on the shoulders of an incredibly talented and very curious set of architects and designers and thinkers and artists in our office. So I think we're the beneficiaries of a very high level of curiosity. And we also, I think there's one more point, and this, in a way, sometimes projects find you just as you find. We actively search for projects that have a broader reach, that perhaps cut across disciplines. So we were very interested in entering the competition for Seattle precisely because we thought the urgency of cross-disciplinary thinking was paramount. And similarly with La Brea, we entered into that project because it pulled us in a way that other projects might not have. So sometimes we find the projects and sometimes they find us.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to pick on a few of the questions that are asking about how your practice has changed in the last year in the context. I guess I would add to that both the pandemic and working remotely, but also the racial and social justice movement. And perhaps I would also add to that in a sense that how do you think a lot of the way you presented many of the projects, you spoke specifically a few times about the idea of sound being a part of architecture and the importance of movement, choreographing that, smell, and also even the social interactions and the type of activities that you anticipate to take place within the projects. And I was also interested in how you measure that or how you account for that through the design process, and how might one kind of predict and design for such conditions.
You know, when you're bringing up something that we've been reflecting a lot internally, both between ourselves and with our community in our office, and even with our students, which is that this has been a year like no other. And between the pandemic, which has, in a sense, kept us apart from each other and yet made us so clearly part of one global community. And I think the kind of incredible sensitivities that have been surfaced on a very public level through Black Lives Matter, or even more recently, the kind of this sort of provocation that we all have to note that there are so many communities that are, in a sense, not included or not seen as anything other than other. And so for us, it really goes back to the foundation of why we started our practice. Michael and I first began doing pro bono projects in Harlem, saying it seems wrong that architecture is only for those who can afford it, and only those who come from privilege can imagine being within works of architecture. And the other aspect was that we felt that very much that parks and public places were the very places where we discovered people who were not like ourselves. And that was truly the public realm, that if it was designed well, we would want to find ourselves there, and we would want to find communities that we would not necessarily see otherwise. And so those were drivers for us with our practice. And arguably this past year has brought those passions into very sharp focus. And with our current work in the Jesse Dawson, the reimagination of the Jesse Dawson jail, for instance, in Dallas, our thought really is, what does it mean literally to take down the walls and remove those barriers and find places where we can find people not like ourselves and find communities to be built that have yet to be built.
Yeah, I would piggyback a couple thoughts, Manon, I think, because it's a very important question. I think we're always searching for a way in which we can leverage public engagement in a project. So even the Penn Laboratory, laboratories are notoriously introverted buildings. We were able to convince the university that they should build a public quad right out on the street so that it would be an amenity and a transition between Philadelphia and the campus, Penn's campus. And I think they were very receptive to the idea of taking a laboratory and giving it a public dimension. And that was something that we try in all our projects to bring to them a much broader sense of a kind of public commitment, a sense that projects are participants. They're not passive, they're active participants in the public realm.
I'm gonna, again, I'm looking at some of the questions and I'm going to ask maybe a shorter question. There's a question about what qualities and skills would you describe is needed to become a good architect? And I want to add to that, earlier before the lecture, you brought up the notion of citizen architects and what at the USC we've been talking about. To your own approach, the way you practice architecture as architects, there is an intertwined relationship between architecture as a autonomous discipline with landscape and urbanism and art. So I would say, yeah. So then, in your view, what constitutes those, qualities of a good architect or a good student who aspires to be a good architect?
I mean, that's
We're still working on that.
Honestly, it's such a fantastic question, and arguably
I have a comment. Yeah,
the things that we find in both the team working with us and with our students, that the most compelling thing that we see is both humility, curiosity, and an absolute passion to be able to discover something in the process of making. And so in many ways, it's probably a conviction that you don't know exactly how you're going to get there or where you're in fact going, but that you know you want to be there. And that's probably all it is.
yeah. I would add one other item because I think often we talk a lot, in the kind of global architectural community, about multidisciplinary thinking. And I'm reminded of Hal Foster's comment, which I think is truer now than ever before, which is, before you can have multidisciplinary thinking, you have to have disciplinary thinking. So if you want to engage a choreographer or a musician, you have to know what architecture can do, just as they need to know what music can do, so you can have a true conversation. And I think that's very important in the context of the pedagogy of architecture. You have to understand what architecture can do. You have to learn to speak its language so that you can engage other languages.
You also mentioned that in many ways you find the right project to be able to pursue your interest and do the type of work that you're passionate about. Reading one of the questions is there one or specific types or programs or projects that you are interested in doing and you haven't been yet able to do?
That's a great question. I think what we're struck by is that if the ambitions are very, very high on the part of a client, often they involve aspects of a project that totally transcend what the brief is because there's higher aspirations to create more value. And so we find ourselves drawn to projects where it's the indescribable aspirations that are about a world that's larger than the individual, the dream, the program that's maybe got a public gift, or maybe something that's a place of reflection, discovery, we don't know. But there has to be an aspiration for something that's larger than just the very terminal description of what the project might be to inspire us. And then it's not about typology. It's not about a skyscraper or a landform. It's really about the dream, and that can lead you to places you've never been, which is where you want to go.
Yeah. We always look for projects, and it's hard at times to find that out, but we look for projects where the question hasn't been answered, where perhaps a client admits that they don't know exactly what the right architecture would be for them. Or we look for sites that are incomplete, orphan sites. We love sites that
frankly are a mess and impossible.
that nobody has loved. And there's something maybe about that is both an incredible stimulant, but also a challenge.
That's interesting. Now, I am, if you're up for more questions, I have one more.
Sure.
You both have been teaching for a long time, and a lot of the projects we've been doing has also connections to educational institutions. And I'm wondering how your experience as teachers, as educators, has informed your practice, but also how your practice has impacted your teaching, and what relationship has, in some ways, how much role have your students played in the formation of your ideas and developments, and how much the practice has informed your syllabi and your teaching.
I mean, it's such a super question, and in many ways it's so close to the bone. I don't know if I could answer it intelligently, because it is a fluid space between the kind of the intellectual reach that we hope to have in the projects that we take on as our research studios and seminars, because there you could actually stretch the boundaries of something well beyond what a typical commission might, so that your research can be deeper and faster with a team of people who are learning with you. And yet the practice allows you to go very deep and very precisely into some things. It's that level of precision and magic, if you will, of these two worlds that creates something that in many ways we don't know if it would thrive without the other. And so it's a little bit like asking a fish to describe what it's like to be in water, because the water is between the practice and the academy, where we find our nourishment.
I'm wondering if Milton is,
Hello?
please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you, Ahmad. And thank you, Michael and Mary. I think that was a really extraordinary journey through your work and your thinking. And I think you've always been great communicators. And I think our students and faculty really appreciate that, and also your answers to the questions. And we look forward truly to having you in LA. We know you'll be here because you're working on the LaBrea Tar Pits project, so you won't be strangers. And so we're gonna have you at the school at some point in the near future. And so thanks again for being with us tonight.
I look forward to that.
We'll take you up on the.
And thanks everybody for coming. We'll be in session again, I believe, April 21st with the Black Reconstructions Collective conversation. So please come back and join us then. Thanks and have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Great questions.